Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the GTK4/GObject tutorial. It's been a little while, but I had some computer issues. I had to get a new computer, and I'm getting newly set up here with my things. So thank you for rejoining me with part 2. I think that you'll find that there's a lot less that we're going to be learning in this part than in part 1. All we're going to do in this episode is learn about adding properties to our GObject. Using GTK4. So let's open up our demo widget.c file. We don't need any modifications to the .h file. First of all, we're going to create an enumeration, and what we do is we want to give a little enumeration keyword for the properties that we have. In this case, we're only going to have one, which will be the label of our widget. And you always want to reserve a final property that will be a placeholder that will tell us the number of properties, and we'll never utilize that property, but it's just there to give us an easy counter for how many properties there are. The 0th property is reserved for GObject internally. You could also do something like prop_0 and then go ahead and delete the =1 there, but I think it's a little bit cleaner to just put the =1 for the first property that you have. Make sure that you do not use the 0th property. We're going to need a static variable that's going to be an array that's going to be called properties. You can call it whatever you want, but often it's typical to call it properties, and it's going to be an array of GParamSpec pointers, and the number of elements to that array will be n properties, which in this case will be 2, basically, which is really one that we can work with. What a GParamSpec basically is it allows you to take what's called a G value that we discussed in the last episode and give it upper and lower and default parameters, and so it's kind of like something like an integer or a string or anything that you like, but on steroids. So instead of just being a plain old integer that can be any old number, it's an integer that has a minimum number of, let's just say, 0, and a maximum number of, let's just say, 1000, and a default of, let's say, 10. So it gives you that extra flexibility, and we'll see why it's very helpful to have paramspec bounds and different specifications for these different types of G types and G values. So let's go scroll down. We have our standard getter and setter functions, get property and set property. Let's come back to that. Let's scroll down further. Nothing's different here. Dispose, nothing's different here. Finalize, nothing's different here. In the class init function, though, that's when things get a bit different, and this is where we're going to go ahead and define our property for our object. Now, in order to do that, what you have to do is override 2 additional virtual functions of the object class. And now, without really thinking about it, we had already done that with the dispose and the finalize subroutines. But what we need to do now is override the set property and the get property virtual functions. Now, where do we find where these are defined? Well, if we go over to the documentation for GObject class, you see we have standard set property and get property virtual functions. So what we need to go ahead and do is create standard C subroutines that map to the set property and the get property virtual functions. And another way to look at it is right way up at the top of the documentation here. You have what's called a GObject get property function and a GObject set property function. So we need to create subroutines that map these prototypes. Okay, and so that's what we're going to do. But before we do that, we're going to have to tell GObject what properties we want for our object. We're going to have a property called label, And what we do is we say properties, open square bracket prop label, which is a property that we enumerated at the top of the file, is equal to, we want this type of property of the label, obviously, to be a string. And so we use the GParam_spec string function to give us a string GParam_spec that we'll be able to put into that array entry. Now the property name will be label. They want a couple of sort of pretty names here that are a little more descriptive. And then they want here what your default will be. And then they want a set of flags. And what I did here is I created a variable called default flags. And it uses an enumeration set of bitwise flags called gparam flags. And I'm using some fairly typical defaults. So we want the param_spec to be read-writable. So we want to be able to read and write to this property. Because we don't want to just have label be stuck as hello world forever. We want to be able to read and set it to something else. We're never going to change the strings in terms of calling it button label and textual label for a lovely button. Those are just fixed. We never need to change those again. We're not going to go ahead and change the properties descriptions behind its back. So that's why we're going to keep the gparam static strings in there. Honestly, I've never once deviated from that. There may be times that you do have to, but I've never had to do that. And lastly, we have the GParam Explicit Notify, which is a newer feature of GObject. I think it was added in version 2.40 or 42, 44, somewhere thereabouts. That's why it's not syntax highlighted, because I've got some older syntax highlighting, but it's sort of more idiomatic, at least looking at the GTK4, for example, source code, to utilize this flag. And I actually prefer to have explicit notification, because if you don't have that in, then a notify signal will be sent every time your property changes, and you might not want that, or even if you do want that, you might want to be able to visually see and control when that notification will happen, and we'll see how that works in a few minutes. And we only have our one property here. If we had more, we would create more entries to the array using this type of subroutine. And then we install the properties, and we're going to do that using the GObject class install properties function. It takes a GObject class, so we're going to pass the object class variable to it. They want the number of properties that we're installing. We already set that up in our enumeration, and that fit into our array nicely. And they want a pointer to GParam_spec. And so basically what they want is an array of GParam_specs that are allocated previously. And we've done that, if you recall, way up at the top of the file. If I make a mark, and here's where we did that there. You see it's a GParam_spec star, and then we have array entry. So it's basically a double star, GParam_spec double star. And then the rest is the same as it was. We'll come back to how this fits into play here. But now that we have told GObject what we want our getter and setter functions to be on the virtual function table of GObject class, let's take a look at what that actually looks like. So struct GObject class. So this is our set property virtual function that we're going to implement as a C function. So they want a GObject star, a property ID, a gvalue star, and a GParam_spec. And so you see that these parameters match up with that perfectly. So that's good. It's idiomatic to use a switch in order to sort of take a look at what property ID you received and then go from there. We only have one property ID. We only have the prop label ID that we set way up above. And basically what we're going to do is just run a method that we are going to define below. We kind of saw it a few moments ago, called demo widget set label. So basically when you get the property when you get label being the property that we're looking to set here, it's going to go ahead and run this subroutine here, and it's going to take the G value, and we need to convert that G value into a standard string to run this subroutine. And to do that, we run G value get string, which is kind of confusing because this is a setter function and we're using a getter function. But if you think about it, you want to get the raw string from the G value and plug it into the standard C subroutine. Okay. And then the default, we have no other properties, so here's some boilerplate code you can just plug in there to just say that, look, we don't have any other properties, so we're going to give the user a runtime warning about that. So just copy and paste boilerplate code right there. Do we have and now our get property function here is, again, has to marry up with this set of parameters here with a GObject star, a property ID, a value, and a p-spec. Okay, and you see it does match that. So we're going to first go ahead and cast the object to a demo widget. I believe we did the same thing above for convenience sake. Yes, we did. And you can do the same exact thing and use a switch on the property ID, and it's passed us in a G value star. So what we need to do is set that G value to the property that we already know exists, okay, from our object. And so again, a little bit counterintuitive, but we're going to use G value set string on the G value that it's given us. And what are we going to set the string to? Well, we have to set it to, it takes a char star or a const char star parameter. So all we need to do is run GTK button get label, because we know we're using a GTK button. So we already have a way of telling it what the string will be to plug in. And so we're just going to use that function that we already have. Okay. It doesn't have to be that way. We could have created, for example, a variable within our object and stored that separately. But why do that when we already have a way to get the label from the button just as easily? Okay. So you're taking a G value, pointer to a G value, and you're plugging in the string that we retrieve by running get label, GTK button get label. And we're plugging that into value, and then we're going to reach the end of the function, and then GObject is going to say, aha, the G value has been set to a beautiful string, but in the G value format. Okay, and so then it will then do its thing and utilize the G value that has been set to a string form of G value, and we'll say, I know what to do with this. Here's the string that applies with that. And the default will be, we don't have any further properties, so again, boilerplate code here to warn that an invalid property ID has been passed in, and as you can see, it's the exact same code as in the setter function. And so now that we've plugged all that code in, we can utilize the standard GObject getter and setter functions in order to do things with our GObject. Okay, so let's go back to our main.c file, and what we can go ahead and do is, instead of doing something like GTK4 label on our label that on our demo widget that we know is a GTK label, or instead of running our subroutine that we defined in our C file that you just saw called GObjectSet label, we can use a standard GObject function called GObjectSet, and that takes a G pointer, which we really know is a GObject. So we can plug in demo, which is our GTK widget demo widget, cast to a GTK widget essentially, and then it wants the property name. We already defined the property name, the only one, to be label. So you're going to take that same char star string for what the property name is, so we know it's label, and what value do we want to set it to? Foobar baz. Okay, and then it takes a null when you've done setting these various object properties. And now take a look at this. This is way cool. So we're going to make and then we're going to run our program, and you see just by using the GObjectSet function, the standard GObjectSet function, we were able to change the label of our button just purely using properties. You may wonder, what's the point? Why not just run, if we pull up our C file again, why not just run demo widget set label, or why not just run GTK widget set label? Why not just set it? Why not you just use a standard C function to do that? Well, when you plug into the GObject system, it gives you various advantages. For one thing, you can do things like create an XML file that says something like property name equals label. Well, I'll just type it here so you can see. Like, you can do something like property name equals label foobar baz, like that, and define your object using an XML file. And with GObject and with GTK Builder, you can actually go ahead and build defaults and build values that way. Also from other languages, you could write a program using PyGObject with Python, and you could be able to use GObject to set these property values and get the property values. And further, you can go ahead and let's just run /main. You can go to the GTK inspector by running Control-Shift-I, and if we go through the hierarchy here, you see demo widgets right there. We can double click on it, and properties is already highlighted, and you see here you can actually see the property that we created. Only because we created this property using GObject can we now see any of this stuff in the inspector. And we can go ahead and change that to anything we want in the inspector, and you can see dynamically it's already changing the text. That is way cool. So the GObject system is very powerful, and without doing anything too complicated here, you can already see how just plugging some things in can really provide some major flexibility. So as you can see, there's many advantages to using GObject and not just doing things using pure C functions. Now I wanted to show you one last thing. Oh, here we're right here. I talked about the explicit notify stuff before. It is important that when you actually define your setter function, we could have just coded it straight here. All this code, we could have just plugged it right here into the set property subroutine. But I thought it was helpful to break it up into a separate function, so I did that here. But when you do that, you can't just set the label and then set it and forget it. You then, because we set the explicit notify, you have to basically emit a signal using this function here to say, look, we've changed the property now. And then it takes a GObject, so we've already got the self parameter here. We're going to cast it to a GObject, and it takes the property param spec type, and so we're going to pass that in too. So that will send the notification out that's required. But you see how it gives us the control as opposed to relying on GObject itself to basically do that for us. It helps us see it, I think, in the code. And so I prefer to use explicit notify, and like I said, that's what the GTK4 sources do. And so I just follow what they do, because they know what they're doing. They're the core developers, and so I just try to follow what they do. And so to me, that was made logical sense to use the explicit notify stuff. And so I hope that helps. That has shown how to add properties to our object and how they basically work. You can see there's just an unlimited number of possibilities. You can use not just strings, you can use multiple different types of G values and G types to work with properties. but the power of them is clear, I think, and it's one of those things that even though it seems like it takes a little bit of extra work to get it up and running, once you've got the code in place, it's not difficult to work with it, it's not difficult to add to it, and then you get all the advantages of being able to look at the inspector, being able to build XML files, and being able to use other languages to tap into that. And so that's it for part 2 of the GObject / GTK4 tutorial. Thank you for watching. Good night and good luck.